Good morning, everybody. As we start today, I am very happy to welcome you to this first opening session for the conference on the 70th anniversary of UNHCR's statute. We are very grateful to all the team behind the scenes who've made it possible this morning to start to make this available across the world online. That team includes people from the University of Essex and UNHCR itself. And I am really happy to be able to welcome the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, Gillian Triggs, who will now give an opening address to launch this series of webinars that will take place today, tomorrow, on the 21st and on the 27th. Good morning, Professor Triggs.
Well, Professor Gilbert and all my colleagues all over the world, good morning from here in Geneva, snowbound Geneva. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few words to open this first global public event for the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network. And may I extend a particular welcome to all exiled and refugee scholars around the world. I thank, if I may, Professor Geoff Gilbert, who chairs the GAIN Secretariat, and to thank the 11 universities and academic institutions that are hosting this event. Well, as a former legal academic, I am truly delighted to see this conference take place as part of our celebrations. As part of the celebrations for the 70th anniversary, as Geoff Gilbert has said, of the UNHCR Refugee Statute, but also, of course, this year in 2021 of the Refugee Convention itself. Well, as you will all know, in 2018, most nations in the world agreed to the Global Compact on Refugees, a non-legal commitment to two central ideas: solidarity in responding to refugees and to all those displaced or stateless throughout the world, and an equitable sharing of the responsibilities for protecting them from danger and persecution, recognizing, of course, that 80% of displaced people are hosted by poor or developing countries. So the aims of the compact are to ease pressure on host countries, to enhance refugee self-reliance, to expand access to third country durable solutions, and to support conditions for safe and dignified returns to the country of origin. The compact was followed in December, just over a year ago, by a pledging forum here in Geneva, at which states, civil society, faith-based groups, universities, scholars themselves, the business community, and refugees made about 1,400 pledges to give practical, concrete effect to the compact, to the vision of the compact. And among many practical measures to implement the idea of responsibility sharing was the creation of GAIN, the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network. And the aim of GAIN, or the many aims, has been to facilitate research and training, education, to have solidarity with scholars and students, but particularly by helping junior colleagues in regions of the world that are less well connected, to enable them to plug into the global networks and discussions. And I think this is a critically important objective of GAIN. So I think as academics, we haven't always managed to work across from the global north to the south, or to ensure that younger colleagues are plugged in to the networks that those of us that have been around a little longer are well established with. Also, we want to establish scholarship opportunities and to broaden the geographic and thematic scope of the disciplines and scholars working on protection issues. The creation of GAIN then really is a recognition of the contribution that scholars have made throughout the history of UNHCR in providing evidence, critical analysis, and promotion of refugee law as it's developed over the last 70 years. Well, of course, it's time now to reflect on progress made by the convention itself, by UNHCR as a UN agency, and to understand the profound changes since 1951, when 6 years after the end of the Second World War, negotiators wanted to find solutions for about 2 million displaced people. Well, today, UNHCR has reported for 2019 that at least 80 million people are now asylum seekers and refugees, including about 48 million forcibly displaced within their own country. Sadly, this number has continued to climb, with increasing violent conflict, environmental degradation, inequality, poverty, and discrimination. And of course, added, to these root causes of forced displacement has been the global pandemic, a COVID pandemic over the last year, all of which have challenged the contemporary role of the Refugee Convention and the Compact. Well, I would suggest, as you start your deliberations and provide your papers, that the Compact and Refugee Law have had an enduring relevance. Indeed, that the Compact has provided a realistic and compelling roadmap to respond to COVID-19 and to addressing some of the root causes of flight. I will, however, be very keen indeed to read the papers that emerge with scholarly reflection on the challenges that we face for the future. And there are some important questions that you will be answering. What do we mean by protection? It's a big word, but what does it actually mean in concrete terms for those we seek to serve and to protect? What is a durable solution? What do we mean by this? Does it have to change to reflect contemporary circumstances? What is the role for technology in learning? We've learned a lot from the COVID-19 pandemic, and we know that using technology can allow us to reach and protect many, many millions more people than has been true in the past. How should we respond to displacement by climate change, one of the issues that I think we're going to be discussing a great deal more this year? And what are the best ways to support host nations? What about a regional approach? How different do we need to be in adjusting to particular regional problems? Well, one of the challenges is the sad fact that only about 3% of refugees are able to attend university. And as part of UNHCR's recognition of the 70 years of protection, a fund has been started to raise 70 refugee scholarships. Well, I'm really pleased to be able to say that this target has already been met with some generous private donations, and we see some real potential now for enhancing that fund and ensuring many, many more young people find their way to university from refugee camps, from urban environments where refugees are, but are unable to source that higher education. Well, we have some wonderful speakers today, and I'd just like to mention, if I may, 4 of them. Mr. Abikar, who is a fellow of the British Institute in East Africa. He has a master's in education through Borderless Higher Education for Refugees, a project in Kenya, and he'll be speaking to us about protection this morning. Professor Awad from the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies in Cairo, who's been particularly helpful in developing the GAIN. And he's a particular advocate for inclusion of refugees in healthcare systems, something, of course, that has very particular relevance in the current environment. We also have Ms. Hala Haj Taleb, who is a member of the Tertiary Refugee Students Network. She's a student of journalism, and she's going to be talking to us about the very ambitious, but we hope achievable task of ensuring that refugees are included in higher education, and that we leap from the 3% I've mentioned to 15% by 2030. But we need that enthusiasm and that drive of our younger scholars, such as Ms. Taleb. And then the last one I'd like to mention is Ms. Jessica Lawrence, who is a lawyer for human rights from the University of Johannesburg. And she's been involved in something that's very important, the litigation, preparing amicus briefs for important challenges to laws that might in various ways challenge or restrict the rights to claim asylum and the rights to never to be subject to refoulement. So I'm going to listen with very great interest. We have a great panel of speakers coming up, people with a lot of experience of refugee law, but I am very, very keen to see over the coming months and years how, as scholars, we can come together to provide evidence, analysis, and information generally about refugee law, and to guide that refugee analysis as it develops to deal with some really major challenges over the coming years. So thank you all very much. I look forward to the discussions, and may I hand back to Professor Gilbert again to take us to the next panel. Thank you all.
Thank you, Gillian. When this idea for a conference on the 70th anniversary of the 1950 statute was first dreamt up back in 2017, I think we'd hoped that we might have 150 people in a conference room somewhere in Geneva. As it turned out, along came COVID-19, and all those plans had to be put on hold. As it is, we now have a conference that will take place over the next 10 days, and it's going to involve 11 universities, research institutions across every single time zone. We are bringing together academics, but also refugees, practitioners, to contribute, and we are being able to reach through Zoom and other platforms people who would never have been able to come to a small conference in Geneva. So while it's taken an awful lot of thinking, preparation, people who in the background have made this morning possible and made the rest of the week possible, I am ever so excited that this series of webinars over the next week or so will manage to reach so many people and hopefully set in place research agendas, new teaching, and bring to the fore scholars who would not otherwise have had a platform like this. If you think about it, the 1950 statute, when it was first adopted by the General Assembly, gave a mandate to UNHCR for 3 years, because they thought in 3 years, hopefully the 2 million refugees in Europe would have been found a durable and sustainable solution that would allow them to return to what was hoped to be the normal way of life. Unfortunately, as the Assistant High Commissioner has just pointed out, it's not 2 million anymore. It's at least 80 million persons of concern to UNHCR. Now, the other thing to say is, of course, that the statute is no longer the entire definition of UNHCR's mandate. This series of webinars is looking not just at the protection of refugees and asylum seekers and returning refugees, but also internally displaced persons and stateless persons too. So UNHCR's mandate has changed. And this is where bringing together so many different scholars from across every single time zone will allow us to share ideas that hopefully will allow UNHCR to take forward their protection and solutions mandate over the next, well, I don't want to say 70 years, because I hope that within that period, we would have better solutions. But just in case 70 years from now, they're holding the 140th anniversary, that what this conference sets in place is better thinking, better planning, better ideas for how to achieve durable and sustainable solutions for refugees and their protection until that ultimate form of protection, a solution, is achieved. What this series of seminars is going to look at is particular regional experiences across the various parts of the world, and it brings together the specialists who can speak to those ideas. What academia has done in this field of law and other disciplines is make certain that our work actually has a practical impact. And I want to make it clear, when I was approached to become the chair of the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network, there were two things that were very important to me. The first is that it said interdisciplinary. I might be a lawyer, but what I wanted to achieve with GAIN was a greater inclusion of specialists across every single discipline. And I hope that watching this series of webinars over the next week or so, we will have people from very different disciplines. At Essex, I am currently working with computer scientists to help UNHCR achieve protection and solutions. I don't think when I first started my research and teaching in this field, I would ever have been working with computer scientists, but that's what GAIN can help to achieve, that we broaden all our perspectives. Academia has a tendency to work in silos. What GAIN hopes can be achieved is that those silos are broken down and that we have greater interdisciplinary approaches that will provide better protection and solutions to all persons concerned, to UNHCR. The other thing that was high on my agenda for GAIN is that we stopped in the global north treating our research projects as ways to do case studies on displaced persons, 85% of whom are found in low or middle income countries. That has got to stop. One of the things that I want GAIN to achieve is that we always make certain that when there are research projects taking place with respect to persons of concern to UNHCR, that those persons are part of the research planning and research study, that much more as well, there is true partnership between universities and research institutes in the global north and the global south. This has got to be something where we can, in future, achieve better research, better teaching, and much more importantly, greater opportunities for refugees and other persons of concern to UNHCR to come and study at university. Now, before we move on to have the discussion between our three panelists this morning, I actually have some technical points which probably should have come a lot earlier, but I am now going to go them. If you encounter any technical problems with the platform, the session is being live streamed on YouTube. I can see that at the minute, and that uses much less bandwidth. To connect to it, just follow the link that is in the chat box. Interpretation is available in English, Spanish, and Arabic, and also, as you can see beside me at the minute, International Sign Language. You do need to have the latest version of Zoom downloaded in order to use the interpretation function, though, as far as I'm aware, though that might have, I am not the technical specialist. With that little bit of technical information, and let's face it, if it was a true conference, I'd now be telling you where the restrooms are and what to do in case of a fire alarm. Let us go immediately and bring in our three panelists for this morning, Helen Durham, Gardi, and Duong. Allow me to introduce them and give a description of their roles and tasks and why we've invited them to come and join us on this panel this morning. Ms. Gardi is an international lawyer and human rights activist. She was born in a refugee camp in Pakistan as her family escaped Saddam Hussein's genocidal campaign against the Kurds. Res is New Zealand's first Kurdish female lawyer. She recently graduated as a Fulbright Scholar with a Master of Laws from Harvard Law School. She's the first Kurd in history to graduate from Harvard Law. She is a Harvard Human Rights Fellow working on cases for the prosecution of ISIS for their targeted genocidal campaign against Yazidis, including mass executions, kidnapping, torture, sexual violence, and other egregious human rights abuses. She is the founder of Empower, a youth-led organization aiming to address the underrepresentation of refugees in higher education. And Duong is the Senior Policy Advisor at Geneva Cities Hub, a platform for urban actors and facilitator for cities and local governments with respect to the UN in Geneva. And Tu worked for 15 years at the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, the FDFA, where she contributed to the multilateral engagement of Switzerland with the United Nations and other international organizations. She has extensive diplomatic and multilateral expertise, robust negotiation skills in human rights and humanitarian affairs. During her tenure at the Swiss FDFA, she was seconded to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and to the presidency of the Human Rights Council. She was also the 2017 UNHCR Executive Committee rapporteur, in which capacity she worked closely with states and UNHCR towards the successful adoption of the conclusion on machine-readable travel documents, one of the most important developments of the last decade, and to hold an Executive Master in International Law in Armed Conflict from Geneva Academy, and a Master's degree in International Relations from the Graduate Institute of International Studies, as well as a Master of Arts and Politics in International Relations from the University of New South Wales, Australia. Dr. Helen Durham is Director of International Law and Policy at the International Committee of the Red Cross, headquartered in Geneva. In her role, she oversees a large global network of international lawyers, policy advisors, armed forces, and police delegates, weapons specialists, sociologists, researchers, and academic experts who work towards the respect of international humanitarian law. She is admitted as a barrister and solicitor of the Supreme Court of Victoria and the High Court of Australia. Dr. Durham previously worked as legal advisor for the ICRC Regional Delegation for the Pacific and was head of office for ICRC Australia. She has also acted as Director of Research for the Asia Pacific Centre for Military Law. She is widely published on IHL topics, having been involved in ICRC operational work in the field, in Myanmar, in Aceh, the Philippines, and the Pacific, and part of negotiations for international treaties in New York, Geneva, and Rome. I don't think we could start with a more qualified panel to look at protection, its law and practice. And my first question goes to Antu Duong. Can I call you Antu, by the way? And you need, yes. A key tool of the protection regime in the last 70 years has been conclusions by UNHCR's Executive Committee. As the 2017 ExCom Rapporteur, you facilitated the successful process to adopt the conclusion on machine-readable travel documents. Could you reflect on what this process taught you regarding adding to the protection toolbox?
So thank you very much, Professor Gilbert. And first, allow me to simply thank the organizer of this conference. And it's a real privilege to participate to this event next to very distinguished panelists. So as you said, the ExCom conclusions are a tool in the protection toolbox. These conclusions have really contributed to complementing and strengthening the international protection regime over the past decades. The objective of the conclusion facilitated as an ExCom rapporteur was simply to recall the obligation of state parties to the 1951 Convention and the 1954 Convention on statelessness, to issue travel documents to refugees and stateless people and to transition to this machine-readable format, which has become a new international aviation standard. It was a very technical conclusion, aiming at ensuring the protection standards remain up to date. I believe the conclusion contributed to renewed energy on the topic. It actually helped states better understand what this issue was all about. It also helped UNHCR in its advocacy efforts. I won't hide that the negotiation proved in fact very political and difficult, whereas ExCom conclusions used to be negotiated in a few days in the past. It has now become a very long and difficult intergovernmental negotiation with much more states being vocal, in particular host countries and countries of origin. But although the process is more challenging, it's also worth underlining that it has gained in legitimacy, given the broad participation of states. Several stakeholders have come to question the need to pursue with ExCom conclusions, given the considerable amount of time and resources devoted to their negotiation and their impact, which is sometimes, of course, difficult to measure. While I really understand these interrogations, I remain convinced, truly convinced, that ExCom conclusions have played a very useful role with regard to the international refugee protection regime, and that they should continue to play such a role in today's challenging environment in which forced human displacement continues unabated. These continue to be relevant and to fill in gaps in the protection architecture and meet new challenges. And I think the next conclusion that are on the work plan testify to this, because they will address important issues such as protection and solutions in the context of a public health emergency. And of course, we all have the pandemic in mind. And they will also address, hopefully, mental health and psychosocial support. So these topics give you a sense of the opportunity that the ExCom conclusions represent to complement the protection regime, and they will hopefully provide practical guidance to operational actors on how to ensure protection in times of pandemic and how to also pay much deserved attention to mental health. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I turn now to Dr. Helen Durham and ask her, at the end of 2019, nearly 80 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide. Could you reflect with us on what the relationship is between current conflict trends and displacement?
Of course, and thank you, Professor. It is a great honour to be part of this important, not just this morning, but the important holistic way that we are dealing with this marking this anniversary, as well as the interface and the very necessary interface between academic studies, reflections, engagement, and those of us that practice. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Of course, conflict has always been a very key driver of displacement, and one doesn't need to think too far or be too imaginative to understand that if you're under threat of your life, if the infrastructure around you is destroyed, that there is a real impetus to flee. But I think if we look at some of the current trends, if I may say so, around conflict, that in the International Committee of the Red Cross, with my 20,000 colleagues, ICRC has grown like UNHCR in conflict zones across the world. We see a number of key trends that I think we need to connect and work on, and I would really love it if people could get inspired to do further studies. One of the big trends we see of conflict today is the protracted nature. So the long time frame, which puts pressure on people, not only when they flee, but also challenges when they want to return. The second conflict trend we see is the role that urbanization plays, both with the fact that more conflicts are being fought in urban environments, which has particular concerns around the types of weapons used during the conduct of hostilities, but also when people flee, they flee to cities. So as the world urbanizes, we cannot but connect urbanization and conflict and the relationship that has with displacement. The third element I wanted to highlight was today the increasing number of parties in a conflict. Often when my colleagues are in the field and we have to negotiate to get access, the number of not just parties from military, but also non-state armed groups, which then fragment into other parties. It makes it very challenging often to get access and very challenging for civilians themselves, and provides a role and an impetus once again to have a relationship with displacement. So urbanisation, protracted, and the fragmentation of non-state armed groups are key trends. But what I wanted to do, having spent some of my life as working as an academic and really valuing the need for us to synthesize together the practical experience with the wonderful way that academics can think, question, provide evidence, is perhaps to very quickly provide a short, I won't say story, but a short example. In the ICRC, we'd take information to be able to work out the best way to provide support. And this is a case of a woman who's displaced in northeastern Nigeria. She was displaced due to the killing of a husband by a non-state armed group and the general ongoing insecurity. She had to flee. She had 4 children of a minor age. She made her way to Maiduguri, and I just wanted to quote one of the things she said. "I used to work as a tailor and sell fabrics, but here I cannot do it because I'm not in the position to. My oldest daughter, 12, now grinds flour and to help local restaurants, and the other 3, aged 3 to 7, go to the market to beg. My children no longer go to school. Apart from needing them to support the household economically, and they would have had to bring their own food to school, and it's something I cannot afford." So I think the key issues which interfaces the question you asked, Professor, is the lack of income and instability due to displacement in an urban environment where there isn't the infrastructure available for her to support her family. The psychological impact, the very negative one, I think it was mentioned by our last speaker, mental health issues. The potential for the very negative coping mechanisms to be developed. We see vulnerabilities there with potential trafficking and the lack of education for children, which goes back to the protected nature. So that's just a little snapshot of the way we need to think very carefully around conflict trends and the issue of displacement. Thank you.
And yes, the 2021 adage must still be turn your mute off. However, first of all, please, everybody call me Geoff. Professor Gilbert, not needed. However, and just to echo what was just said, in my work in the field with UNHCR as an academic, the one thing that has always come across whenever you speak to the displaced children is that they want education. They want to go to school, whether I saw that in Niger or in Colombia. And I think this is something that is so important. If we want more than 3% of refugees being able to access university education, we need more of them able to go to school at the relevant sort of primary and then secondary. That brings me on to speak to Gardi and ask her, a significant feature of your childhood, okay, was first-hand experience of protection, and you have complemented this knowledge through study of international law. With your familiarity with both law and practice, what stands out to you as critical aspects of protection in the years to come?
Thanks, Geoff. Tēnā koutou katoa, tēnā o, ko Zagros te maunga, ko Triggs te awa, ko Gardi te iwi, ko tika tangata te waka, ko Gardi aho, tēnā koutou katoa. And I'm sorry to the interpreter, I sprung that Māori language on you without preparation, but just in honor of te reo Māori, and te ao Māori from the country which has given me all the opportunities that I've had today, New Zealand. It's imperative that I begin my presentation with my pipiha. So my name is Gardi. It's a pleasure to join you all today alongside such a phenomenal panel, and thank you, Geoff, for that introduction. In relation to the question that you've raised, yes, given my personal experience of displacement, I learned about the denial of human rights and the lack of justice before I knew what those concepts meant legally. As refugees, the circumstances we're born into are shaped by powers that are beyond our reach, yet we're the ones that live the consequences of persecution and displacement and the laws purportedly used to provide pathways to protection. As a refugee, going through the legal processes of refugee status determination, identification, credibility assessments, and asylum proceedings can be incredibly empowering and frustrating. We're subject to laws and systems that were not created for us or by us. And while it's referred to as refugee protection, unfortunately, with a lot of events around the world, we see that in many ways it epitomizes a system that is often designed to protect against us rather than to protect us. And while theoretically seeking asylum is recognized internationally as a right, in practice, many asylum seekers around the world are treated as criminals and have difficulty accessing their rights. The political discourse on refugees has shifted from seeing us as at risk to seeing us as a risk, and paradoxically, a system that's designed to protect some of the most vulnerable people in the world can sometimes make us feel even more vulnerable and helpless, further exacerbating the pain of fleeing from our homes. As refugees, we find ourselves tasked with navigating the complexities of a legal system, and this is often in a language that is foreign to us, in the hope of reaching some semblance of protection afforded under the Refugee Convention as recognized refugees. Yet often we're disappointed because it's so difficult to successfully navigate these systems, and it doesn't always result in guarantees. For example, access to education, employment, and living a somewhat dignified life in the host country can remain everyday uncertainties. And especially the prospect of being settled in a third country, with the UNHCR figures indicating that less than 1% of the world's refugees are resettled annually, the chances are incredibly slim when it comes to resettlement. My family was told it would be 6 months before we were resettled when we were refugees in Pakistan, and it ended up being 9 years. And this is probably along this end of the scale of being quite a short time period of spending in a camp compared to some of my fellow colleagues and friends that I've made across the globe who have spent 20, 30 years in camps. Being born as a refugee in a camp, I was at one point one of these statistics referred to in the UNHCR Global Trends reports about the number of displaced people worldwide. But as the Assistant High Commissioner, Gillian Triggs, raised this important statistic, the other 3% of refugees who complete higher education, I also fall into this statistic. And while there are many scholars like me who happen to have lived experiences of displacement, refugee voices are still largely unheard in refugee research and scholarship. And this is where the work of GAIN will be incredibly crucial in the years to come. I think what's really important to raise is that while many of the Refugee Convention's drafters, and important to reflect after 70 years, were themselves refugees and drew directly on their personal experiences of displacement, today we're seeing a considerable lack of refugee engagement on issues that impact us, from decision-making outcomes to research that has the potential to influence law and policy related to the predicament that's faced by refugees. It's really imperative that refugees play a key role throughout, and there have been many efforts throughout over the years that I've been participating at UNHCR events on a global level. We've seen a considerable effort and progress made, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Refugee situations have increased in scope, in scale, and in complexity, and this means that we need new and innovative methods for protection, for assistance, and for solutions. And while the status quo continues to work for some issues really well, large-scale refugee movements and protracted refugee situations continue to persist, indicating that some things really need to change. And so my final point is that in light of all of this, finding the best responses and solutions for the complex issues facing the millions of displaced people across the globe requires strong evidence-based research and a commitment to translating findings into impact. And this requires input from those who with the lived experiences of displacement for the development of policies that are closer to the reality on the ground. Thank you.
I think that that was a very telling presentation. I would say that in 30 years as an academic teaching refugee protection at Essex, the number of refugees I have taught has never been large, but there have been some. In fact, some actually became refugees while they were studying at Essex because of changes back home and because of what they were studying, international human rights and humanitarian law. And yes, the engagement with those who have the lived experience is so important if we're going to make certain that protection is appropriate in the coming years. Can I turn again to Anne too? And you too have a unique perspective of law and practice as both the child of refugees and a professional who's worked for 15 years in human rights and humanitarian affairs for a state. From these experiences, what stands out to you as key changes in understanding and perception for protection today?
Thank you, Geoff. And here maybe I'd like to share some of my very personal view with regard to the change in the perception of protection. As you said, I'm a daughter of refugees, and as such, I can testify to the very positive mindset of the state and of the population, which led to the granting of refugee status to the members of my family 50 years ago. So in preparing for this event, I called my uncle, my mother, basically, and I asked them, tell me about an anecdote, that happened, when you were basically seeking for refugee status here in Switzerland. And my uncle told me that he found a classified ad posted at a university chart where a man was simply offering his help to Vietnamese refugees. So my uncle called, and that man was actually using his network, his personal network, to help Vietnamese refugees integrate into the local labor market. Just like that, for free, because people had heard about the Vietnam War in the media and they were willing to help those fleeing communist regimes. They were curious about, how Vietnamese people were living, what they were eating. They were curious and they just wanted to help. So it's just an anecdote. It's definitely not representative. It's very subjective and probably very Euro-centered as well, but it gives you a bit of a hint about the mindset at that time. And although that positive mindset may remain, I think that states and populations' fatigue vis-a-vis refugee flows is palpable. And Rez talked about the extensive difficulties that she and more generally refugees face today. So unfortunately, I think the openness which my family benefited 50 years ago is probably no longer the same. And it's not a coincidence that the Global Compact on Refugees was adopted 2 years ago, and that the latter promotes a much needed multi-stakeholder approach. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Can I come back to you, Helen, and ask you, the major cause of displacement over the past 70 years has been conflict. Now, the ICR seeks to uphold the international law of armed conflict for the benefit of all civilians and non-fighters. But what are the special features of humanitarian protection that apply to forcibly displaced persons?
Well, thank you very much. And I think the connection between international humanitarian law, or the law of war, refugee law, environmental law, and a range of other international legal norms is increasingly being understood of needing to be connected more together. So I wanted to start with that. I think it's really important that we all have our specialties, but I think as academics too, we know today, the most important thing is to break down silos, although keeping these elements within their original vision is also important. So the first thing is I think the law is critical role to play here, and it's been wonderful to be on a panel with people with both experience personally, but also as our two other beautifully eloquent speakers were able to bring in their own experiences. So from the law, international humanitarian law, perhaps maybe I'll start first around how it might be able to not stop, but play an impact on displacement. Now, I think the first point is international humanitarian law aims to reduce suffering during times of armed conflict. So even if it is correctly applied and implemented, there is still a large degree of suffering during times of armed conflict. I think as the short story that I started with from one of our those people that we serve in the field, the effects of hostilities, if non-state armed groups and military do not attack civilians, that has a range of course, very obvious elements that can prevent or at least limit the displacement. The second issue around international humanitarian law and displacement relates to the range of laws that relate to the conduct of hostilities, the requirement not to attack in an indiscriminate manner, the requirement to be proportional in attacks, the requirement found in the legal framework to not destroy infrastructure necessary for the survival of the civilian population. Obviously, if the sewage system is destroyed, if hospitals are bombed, if schools are damaged through to indiscriminate attacks, then you're going to have populations that feel they have no other choices but to flee, not only for their own physical safety, but to find a place where they can survive. So I think a better respect for international humanitarian law by parties to a conflict has a very strong relationship with this issue of displacement. But I also think when individuals are displaced, international humanitarian law, like human rights law, like refugee law, and the range of other norms that have particular applications but need to be looked at, can play a role. The one I wanted to focus on for a moment relates to humanitarian access. Because of course, if people are displaced and they're not in the position to provide for their families, we need to make sure that there are satisfactory conditions of shelter, hygiene, health, nutrition, and that if and when family members are separated, they're able to be reunited. So international humanitarian law also looks about trying to inform family members, and what we call them reunite the missing together. So I think the final point, because I know we're short of time and there's a lot of work to be done here, so I urge scholars that are interested to really look into this. But finally, I'd like to say that respect for international humanitarian law can contribute to finding durable solutions. I think we talked about that at the start, and Gillian flagged that. I think when individuals flee, either internally displaced or become refugees, I think if there hasn't been a full destruction of their homes back where they wish to return to, I think there is a much better capacity for finding durable solutions. International humanitarian law does provide that displaced persons have a right to voluntary return in safety to their homes or places of residence as soon as they can for residence, as soon as the reasons for their displacement cease. So I think you've got a range within this legal framework of elements that, if international humanitarian law is better respected, can have a reduction on the not only the fleeing of individuals, but the impact. And then you've got specific norms that aim to provide interfacing with other legal systems, some support and protection for those who find themselves in the situation of displacement. So thank you for that opportunity. And as I said, I think there's a lot of work to be done in this area, which really makes a difference to individuals' lives. Thank you.
Thank you. I would now move to Res because, as you pointed out, Helen, we are running short of time. And the GCR, the Global Compact on Refugees, describes protecting and caring for refugees as life-saving for the individuals involved, and that it importantly needs to be accompanied by dedicated efforts to address root causes. You're currently preparing the prosecution case against ISIS. What is this experience teaching you about addressing root causes?
Thanks, Geoff. Yeah, so I'm currently based in the Kurdish region of Iraq, working as part of an international team of lawyers gathering evidence for the targeted genocidal campaign carried out by ISIS against the Yazidis. And we're this work involves many NGOs and state participation. So I think what importantly I've learned from this work is that, firstly, the situation, the tragedy that occurred and the crimes that were committed against the Yazidis were, yes, in fact, awful, but this was not just a one-off event. I think there was a lot of events that happened which led to this happening to the Yazidis. For example, the discrimination and the lack of rights and the treatment of Yazidis within Iraq. And so in terms of root causes, I think what a lot of these conflicts show, is that, sorry, can you hear me? My internet keeps staying unstable connection and okay. So what I was saying is that within Iraq, as an example, the treatment of Yazidis, the discrimination by the government and by others living in Iraq alongside the Yazidis really created this grounds for the events that occurred. And so when addressing the crimes, for example, against the Yazidis, yes, we're working on the prosecution of ISIS, but that's not where it's going to end. If we don't address the root causes within the country, the treatment of them, access to rights, the living conditions, for example, rebuilding Shingal and the circumstances in which they're living in, access to employment and education. Unfortunately, I don't think that this will address the issues that we're dealing with today, such as the mass killing, the executions, the kidnapping, the torture, the sexual violence. The Yazidi population has faced 70 genocides prior to the attack by ISIS. And so when we're thinking about how to deal with conflicts, I think we need to be thinking about the root causes, not just what to do once the conflict has occurred and once these tragedies have occurred. In order to address this, I think we need to be thinking about how governments can work together, how states need to be working together. And an issue like this, like for example, ISIS is not just an event or a tragedy or a group of people relevant to this part of the world. Their impact is far-reaching and it's impacted people across the globe. And I think it's imperative that states work together on how to address these kinds of issues and not just thinking about solutions to the refugee crisis, but actually how to ensure that these things don't happen again. And as the High Commissioner stated in one of his statements, he said he challenged the international community to put him out of a job. And I think that's what really we should be working towards, how to address these issues so that we don't have refugee situations in the first place.
Thank you. As someone who started as an international criminal lawyer, moved sideways into the human rights and then into refugee protection, the need for bringing all those different elements of law together, and then sort of to recognize that even that leaves you in a silo, that you're still just a lawyer, and there is a need to work with all the other disciplines. We are rapidly running out of time, so rather than go to the third question, what I would like is to ask each of the panelists in turn to say what they think we should take forward for the coming years. I'm not going to say the next 70 years, for the coming years in terms of protection. So I'll turn to you first, Antu. Could you say in a minute what you would like us to take forward?
Well, very simply, I have one message, coming from my organization, the Geneva Cities Hub, which seeks to better connect cities to the multilateral work here in Geneva. I think we have to implement the multi-stakeholder approach that the GCR is talking about now, is trying to embody. So please better include cities in the international protection debate. We have to have additional means, but also additional actors that can contribute to upholding protection towards refugees, stateless persons, and IDPs. And cities actually bring very pragmatic solution to this multilateral migration debates. And they might be able to, bring some dispassionate and deep dispassionate views and depoliticize the conversation around refugee challenges. So bring cities to the table, allow them to participate to the debate, and they might help you with solutions. Thank you.
Helen, can I turn to you next?
Sure. Now, very quickly, Geoff, I think obviously coming from the International Committee of the Red Cross, one of the things we really want to do is start connecting people thinking about respect for the laws of war, ensuring that parties to a conflict take all precautions they can. It has to be part of the way we think about increasing the protection and even the prevention of those who are displaced. I think this symbolically is also about us as scholars and as practitioners talking more to each other, but bringing in a range of skills and expertise. Just as much as GAIN is very exciting, in the ICRC we've set up CORE, which is the Centre of Operational Research and Experience, which tries to take the research, it tries to take the experience in the field. Often people are too busy doing it. They're too busy rowing the boat to rebuild the boat, and bringing it together to make sure we think about that more widely. So breaking down silos, I think it has been said, using anthropologists, looking at not only the norm framework, we need governments to be held accountable to the legal obligations that they've signed up to, but we also need communities to understand what their rights are, what the obligations they can put pressure on, and we need to make sure that the law makes sense to people, that we find ways that it gives traction, that we keep it universal, but we talk about it in a way that allows people to understand it better. So I would say connect more and ensure that we can live up to the obligations that are in existence. That would take us a lot further than today. Thank you. Thank you, Geoff.
Thank you. And Rez, can I ask you to conclude the panelists' presentations?
Yeah, so I want to end on the importance of supporting participation. Not only is refugee participation an ethical imperative, it can also contribute to changes in policy, the development of law, durable solutions that are innovative, sustainable, and more impactful. I think the importance of reflecting the perspectives of those with lived experiences of displacement has been highlighted in many fora, and there's been many efforts. However, a number of obstacles still hinder the participation of refugee scholars. So we need to develop more effective measures for redressing the imbalance in legal scholarship to include refugee voices. We need to create scholarship identified by people currently displaced to address current and future challenges associated with forced displacement. And to achieve these goals, we need to prioritize and provide an orientation towards capacity building and co-designing to ensure that it can provide a platform for scholars with displacement experiences. And I think with leading and emerging scholars around the globe, we can facilitate research, training, and scholarship opportunities which result in specific deliverables, and to ensure genuine and effective participation and involvement of refugees in academic work, which has then the potential to impact and respond to challenges and opportunities that relate to us. I want to end on the note that with the unprecedented numbers of displaced people, and especially in light of all the events around the globe and the experiences of COVID-19, what we've really seen is that we need to work together now more than ever to come up with practical, effective responses to the many challenges that we face, including displacement. And this needs to be through multi-dimensional, multidisciplinary, and intersectional approaches. The refugee call for nothing about us without us is not merely just a call for us to be invited to consultations and then to be written about, but actually a call to make space for us to use our skills and perspectives and experiences alongside other experts and scholars, academics and governments to contribute directly After all, as refugees, we have the expertise in the issues that affect us, and we should be treated as such.
Thank you. Standing at home, rather than in Geneva, in a city of sanctuary, Colchester, working for a university of sanctuary that is just under the Global Refugee Forum, offered scholarships to refugees for the first time. What the panelists have said is so important. Can I thank Dr. Helen Durham and to Duong and Gardi for their contribution? Can I thank especially all the interpreters who have gone on 3 minutes longer than we'd actually asked for? Many, many thanks. And for the tech team in the background who made all this possible. There is another opening ceremony this afternoon at 1600 Central European Time. Thank you to all of you who have stayed with us, watched, and I hope that you've learned stuff. Please come along to the webinars tomorrow, Thursday, and on the 27th for the closing session. Looking forward to seeing some of you this afternoon, and thank you once again to all of you, and particularly to UNHCR, the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, and our panelists. Thank you.